Welcome to Full Prefrontal, the show that exposes the mysteries of executive function. This podcast is a collection of conversations about the role of the prefrontal cortex, which impacts your focus, planning, problem-solving, emotional balance, and independence. So join us as we explore executive function and the science of learning. And now, here's your host, the founder of EXQ, Sucheta Kamath.
Welcome back to Full Prefrontal, exposing the mysteries of executive function. I'm your host, Sucheta Kamath. I think you all know our mission. Mission is to bring the findings from neuroscience, psychology, education, philosophy, maybe even anthropology and social cognition, so that everyday transformations can become more transparent to all of us, and all of us are propelled towards personal and collective growth. This podcast has specific 3 goals. As you know, that one is to explain what is the nature and scope of executive function and how crucial these set of skills are for our personal development, but also those children that we are responsible for so that they can move towards self-sufficiency. And even the ambitious project or the key to moral development is very strong prefrontal cortex. So maybe we can make connection there. The second is to help motivate the current self, which is always bogged down by the needs and pressures of the current moment, to investigate the blind spots and the true nature of the needs of the future self. And so kind of create a pathway from current self to the future self. And the last thing is to really help all those who are tasked to help children, particularly since we are responsible for our children. And if we are the educators or stakeholders, we need to know what does it take to create a personal playbook for a personal success by mastering executive function, and what kind of lens that we need to activate to inform that worldview. So with that, I am so honored to have a dear friend, an incredibly brilliant mind, and a leading expert in his own area of education, Dr. Garry McGiboney. He's the Chief of Operations of Health Security Dynamics and Executive Director of Government Programs at Sharecare and a consultant for United States Department of Education. He was the Deputy State Superintendent for Georgia Department of Education for 14 years. He serves on the Behavioral Health Reform Commission, State Juvenile Alternatives to Detention Committee, Council on Alcohol and Drugs, and Georgia Parent Support Network Board. He is a prolific author and a deeply thoughtful person and a poet, I'm going to say. He also co-founded the Georgia Education Climate Coalition with a membership of over 80 organizations. He has several professional journal publications and, as I mentioned, several books. Particularly, I am very interested in him sharing his wisdom from his second edition, The Psychology of School Climate, but he has also written several other books and papers, and he's the leading thought leader in helping us understand how we can engage students. So welcome to the podcast, Garry. How are you?
Good. Thank you very much. I'm honored to be here.
Well, every presentation I have heard you speak and every conversation I have had, I have felt incredibly inspired. And so I want to start with you from your younger self. When you were a child in K-12 education, when did you how were your executive function skills, your ability to formulate goals, persist, focus, make plans? And when did you become more self-aware student and more in charge of your learning?
Well, it was quite a journey. I was born into, I won't say poverty, but our family did not have a lot of means. My brother, who was 6 years older than me and passed away several years ago, was the first person in our family to graduate from high school. I was the first one to go to college, but interestingly enough, in elementary school, I was a very good student, straight A's, just sit in the front of the class. But I did not adapt to adolescence in a very smooth fashion.
I see.
So when I went to high school, and the high school, we did not have middle school. We had a K-7 elementary school and then 8-12 high school. And when I went into high school, it was a different journey. I did not have the best experience with the with the teachers that I had when I first entered high school. So I dropped out of high school.
What kind of experiences did you have that made you not connect with your schooling experience?
They were just disinterested in the students. And I
And
can't say it was all the teacher's fault. I just did, like I said, did not make a good transition into adolescence. And
I see.
I was not a discipline problem in school, but I lost interest, got into trouble with juvenile court
Really?
because I was prone to get into fights pretty quickly. Not at school, a few fights at school, but not anything major. But in the community, I was hanging around the wrong crowd and got into some pretty serious fights. And so I was locked up 4 times and sent to juvenile court 4 times. Back in that day in the county and the community I lived in, they did not have a juvenile court. You went to the Superior Court, and they really did not have juvenile detention. So I spent time in adult jail cell. One time I was there, and a 21-year-old was put in the same cell with me, and we got into a fight, and that's how I have a broken nose and a cauliflower ear. It's from that fight.
Oh
But
my goodness, Garry.
But I had an angel of sorts in the courtroom one day, and it happened to be a motorcycle police officer.
Really?
Came out of court with my father, who's the one who would take me to court, and came out of the courtroom, and the motorcycle cop that we didn't know, this Officer Burgess, said, "What's going on with you?" And I said, "Well, I had kind of an attitude, so I'm sure I said something that I shouldn't have said." And he said, "Well, we'll talk sometime in the future." Well, in the meantime, I got in trouble again, went back before the Superior Court judge. But this time I made it worse because I smarted off to the judge.
Oh, no.
Yeah. So he said, "Okay, I'm going to give you a choice. You can go back to school or you can go to adult work camp." So I said,
My goodness.
whatever you want, Judge. Just had an attitude. So you can see why the teachers did not relate to me very well. Anyway, so I went to adult work camp. I had my own guard who told me he would blow me in half with a shotgun if I didn't behave. So I behaved, and I worked with the adults. And that was very difficult. That was physically challenging and emotionally challenging. So when I went back to the judge 3 weeks later, he said, "Now what do you want to do? Go back to the work camp, or do you want to go back to school?" So I said, "Well, I think school looks better now." The motorcycle cop, Officer Burgess, was kind enough to come by the school once a week, and we just talked. And to make a long story short, I'll shorten it. I graduated from high school some way. I just barely got through. But in those days, this was in the DeKalb community, the community college had an open door policy, so it didn't matter what your grades were in high school. As long as you had a diploma, you could go to college. So that's how I got into college, was through that door. And when I did the placement exams, my scores were so low, I had to take remedial classes for a year.
Wow.
And I was working full time, working at night, well into the night, menial jobs, labor intensive jobs, and going to school during the day as much as I could. But I made it through the first year of the remedial classes. I had a lot of help from the teachers, just fantastic teachers at the community college, very patient. So after the first year of remedial classes, I was taking, quote, real college camp courses the second year. But I was still struggling, and I was taking college, the basic college English class 101, and it was taught by a professor, Dr. Zenobia Lyles, who actually was the department head of English at Ohio State University at one time, but she retired and moved to DeKalb County to be with her family, and she was very intimidating. But for some reason, she stopped me after class one day and she said, "Do you need help?" And I said, "Yes, I do." She said, well, come by my office. So I did. I went by her office, and bless her heart, she tutored me. I wouldn't have made it without her. She tutored me in her class, but also she tutored me in math and social studies, and whatever class I had, she was my tutor, and without her, I would not have made it through. So then my third year in the 2-year college, because, community college is basically 2 years, but it took me 3 years. My third year there, I realized I could do the work, and I excelled and made the dean's list every semester that third year, and that's what got me into Georgia State University, where I also had just fortune to have wonderful professors. And from that, I realized that I had, because I was told that I had a different perspective on learning than some of the professors had seen with some other students, so they encouraged me to keep going. So when I got my bachelor's degree, and remember now, I'm still working full time because my family didn't really have the means to pay for my college, so I had to pay for everything. So I lived in a basement apartment.
Oh my goodness.
Working full time. Get home about 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning from my job. Get up and go to class at 8 o'clock in the morning, 9 o'clock in the morning. But that was okay because I was focused. I had a purpose. I found it challenging, and it wasn't a burden. It was really kind of inspiring because what I lacked in high school and what I found in college was a challenge. In high school, and what drove me to fight was a challenge. I needed a challenge. And so it was redirected, and the college professors were wise enough to see that in me, that I needed a challenge. But I couldn't do it alone. I needed some skills to rise up to the challenge, just like you need skills to fight. You need skills to rise up to the challenge intellectually. And so they gave me those skills to rise to the challenge intellectually so I could move to the next level. So from I went to the bachelor's degree to the master's program. And when I finished that, I was able then to get a job teaching, but thought, I really want to do more than teaching. So then I majored in psychometry and got the master's degree in psychometry, which led me to school psychology, which led me into an interesting career when I went into the CAB school system, which is a school system that I attended. I graduated from the CAB school system, and then I ended up going back to the CAB school system as an employee. But I went to school and when I got the master's degree in school psychology and then specialist degree in school psychology, I became a school psychologist. And I loved that job. I love working with children. I love solving problems. I love helping them solve their problems, which many of them were somewhat like me in that they needed to be challenged, but they needed the skills to rise up to that challenge.
I think, Garry, sorry, continue. I didn't mean to interrupt.
Then one thing led to the other, and then the administrators in the DeKalb school system said, well, we need for you to move into administration. And I really didn't want to. I enjoyed being a school psychologist. So that's how I went directed into administration, was because I was recruited to go into administration. And that in itself is a different story. But anyway, each level was a challenge. So I ended up getting into the doctoral program.
Well, thank you for taking the time to really, really explain your journey. I think this has direct bearing on executive function conversation we are having. I do think that I love the statement you made, and it's your older self looking back at your younger self, and you said, I did not adapt to adolescence. And I think this can present itself in such a sometimes self-sabotaging way. And only a mature adult or adult with psych-wise adult can actually recognize that, because a young man in elementary was getting straight A's and suddenly is declining his intellect has definitely not fallen off
Right.
out of his brain.
Right.
But I also, what stands out to me is these two amazing humans, psychologist Julius, I forget his last name, who in 70s talked about this concept of presence of a charismatic adult in a child's life from whom the child draws strength. And you had Officer Burgess and Dr.
Laos.
Laos. I went to OU, by the way. So I just think that somebody paused and said, "Do you need help?" Somebody said, "Why are you getting in trouble?" And
Right.
even when you did not know why you were getting in trouble, you can verbalize now that you needed a challenge. You were getting bored. This was too petty, simple, not relevant. That an adult recognizing has transformative power. But the last thought comes to my mind, and I would love your wisdom before we dive into your expertise, is I had many years ago, I had an expert, Dr. Horacio Sanchez, and I was telling him a story of a child growing up in poverty and how she overcame and became this of great success. And he said to me, he stopped and said to me, "Sucheta, I appreciate the story, but we should not focus on exceptions. We should actually treat every child that has that potential and not really have success stories look back and say, I rose above it, so can everybody else." But that help is what we should focus. So I'm just curious. And I now see a deep and love and caring you have for students, particularly systems that can accidentally or intentionally exclude them from having a phenomenal learning experience. I'm just curious what you think about what can we do at a systems level, or maybe that's too advanced a course question before we get into other parts of it. But I think you responded well to Officer Burgess, and I'm just curious, what was it, what primed you to be that way? Like, was there enough suffering already you endured and you're like, okay, I don't need this? Or is it nobody really cared for you, so carefully asked you that compassionate question, like, what can we do to intercept when we see struggling students, children? And parents can do that. Teachers can do that.
Well, it was my relationship with Officer Burgess, who, by the way, became the police chief in
Oh, really?
many years later. But my relationship with him developed organically. It wasn't quick in developing. It developed over time. But what I appreciated the most with him is that he shared his difficulties with me. It wasn't just what's wrong with you, or what do you need, or what's the matter with you, or what can I do for you. It's, well, let me tell you what I went through. And he had a very difficult childhood. He had a very loving parents, but they had difficult times. And so he shared of himself, not only his time, but his story. But I know, now looking back, the reason he shared his story is because he was telling me lessons he learned during his lifetime. And so he was sharing lessons with me through his stories. Because he knew that I had probably, he heard the judge lecturing to me, and he probably knew that my parents had lectured me, because my parents were wonderful. I mean, we didn't have any money, but my parents were wonderful. My mother was an angel, and my father had the patience of Job. They were wonderful. So this is not any reflection on them whatsoever, but Burgess was one of these people that knew that.
What hardship were you going through at that time as a young adolescent?
Well, I was bored. The relationship with other teenagers was kind of strained.
Gotcha.
Because adolescence is a social dance. You're dancing around, and you're not connecting. You're just dancing to see how you fit. You're dancing to see how others fit. And if you're an adolescent and you make a connection, sometimes that's the exception and not the rule. It's just a lot of dancing around. and I got tired of the dance. So I pretty much isolated myself from the dance and disassociated myself from that social
You
dance.
withdrew. You said, this is
Yeah,
not for me.
yeah. I said, this is really not. I'm not learning anything.
This is not my scene.
This is not my thing. It's not a challenge to me. So disassociated with that. But going back to Officer Burgess, he was willing to share his life and what he learned, lessons he learned from his life.
Well, that brings us to this topic. I love that, he shared, and sharing is not just time. He actually opened up. So psychologically, he was wise. He shared his story. So it was not a one-time thing. He also kind of shared his lessons. So he primed you to even receive his lessons through time and his personal relevance through a story. And he humanized himself in front of you. He was not this superior being. I'm an adult, I know more, or you know less, which you sound like you respected.
And Dr. Lyles was different. She didn't share stories about herself. What she talked about was, let's talk about your skills. What are you good at? What do you have trouble with? What do you like? She made a distinction between what do you like and what do you enjoy.
Wow.
And so she probed a little bit more into my intellect and into my emotional status. But she didn't share a whole lot about herself, which was okay with me because we were talking about the challenge of what can I do next. You can do this, but what else can you do? What can we focus on as far as strengths, and what do we need to work on as far as weaknesses? And she was the first one to tell me that many times a weakness is not a lack of skill, it's a lack of exposure. It's lack of experience. And I had not heard that before. And that was, to me, a very defining moment, because sometimes we unintentionally make students feel stupid. And what we're really trying to tell them is that, well, you just haven't learned this yet. You just haven't had the experience yet. And that's why I'm here, to not only help you learn, but also to give you that learning experience. Because learning is an experience. It's not a thing. It's an experience. And I'm here to help you have a learning experience so you can improve your skill set. And sometimes I think we make children feel like they're not adequate enough, that they're missing something, that we set expectations that they feel like they need to reach without the skills to get to that level. But Dr. Lyles was just a different approach, but it was appropriate for that time. I didn't really need her story. I didn't really need her personal life story. What I needed was what she
actual skills. Yeah.
What
And
she
so interesting you're saying, because I think both these adults met different needs of your milestone of development. I think you were much younger when you met Officer Burgess, and he actually just focused on creating a relationship that could rope you back into the engagement piece. But when I'm not pronouncing her name, Lowe's, she actually showed you the specifics about how to succeed in learning. And what a slight differentiation, but profound impact on your ability to then run with it, because you had the ingredients within you. That brings me to this topic that I want to focus on. And this, again, listeners, you might be wondering, are we getting into the thick of executive function, or how does this all pertain? But if you are interested in how learning happens and how learning happens in the interpersonal spaces, Dr. McGiboney is our man, and he's going to help us understand the true nature of this idea of the biggest struggle. And all the data that I'm reading, Garry, is about how kids are not engaged. They are not liking their schooling experience. And that immediately is impacting teachers' feeling of burnout. They're feeling that I'm not honored or respected for the very profession I call teaching. And the kids are feeling the way you are presenting information or what it is not making any sense to me. So I think we are situated to talk about school culture and climate. So maybe if you can help us kick off with, and from a psychologist perspective, what gets kids engaged, or what is engagement to you as an expert?
Well, before we get to that, I think we need to explore a little bit of what is required before you can be engaged in
I love it. Okay, let's
learning.
do that. What's expected of children?
It's we talk about, you hear now in the news and in the professional ranks, a lot of reference to literacy and focus on literacy. And Georgia created the Literacy Commission, and from that we hear a lot about the science of reading. Everybody's talking about the science of reading. We need to be talking about the science of learning, and even before that,
I've been talking about that. Yes.
And even before the science of learning is the science of engagement,
or science of motivation.
and even before that is the science of language development. We kind of skip over the language development, and we also skip over the engagement, and we also skip over the learning to get to the science of reading. And we need to back up and start from, we just assume that all children have language skills. We just assume that that's something that we don't even really need to talk about. But the research is, especially research in the UK, they're way ahead of the United States in the research on language development. They have found that a lot of children have a deficit in language-rich environments. They just have not been in a language-rich environment. It used to be at one time that was primarily children living in poverty, where there's just not a whole lot of dialogue in the home. But now they're finding it's spreading more into the middle and upper class because of smartphones and tablets, and we're not engaging in conversation anymore. So that lack of language development now is becoming more widespread. And when I talk about language development, I'm talking about expressive, receptive, and pragmatic language.
And as a speech pathologist, this is my wheelhouse. Yes.
There you go. And
we've been talking about this so deeply, but it's completely out of the conversation unless you have a disorder like language developmental delay, which is, we're missing the mark on it.
Yeah, we're not even talking about disability. We're not talking
exactly.
about a delay. We're just talking about experience and exposure to language. But imagine a student, regardless of age, even an adult for that matter, if you have good receptive language skills, but you have underdeveloped expressive language skills. In other words, you understand everything that's going on around you, but you have a difficult time expressing yourself, asking the right questions, or even asking questions. Imagine how frustrating that would be, and that's not going to lead to very much engagement in learning or engagement in the classroom. So I think we need to back up and do some type of assessment of what can we do in the classrooms to understand the language of our children. And there's a way to do that. I work with Emily Rubin, who is a speech and language pathologist, and Ariane Weldon, who is an epidemiologist, and we developed Language as a Missing Link toolkit, which is available for anyone on the Sandra Deal Literacy Center website at the Georgia State College and University. And it doesn't really talk about developmental delays. It's not based on age bands. It's based on kind of flipping the script, where this is where children are with their language. If we don't communicate with them at their level, they're not going to move to the next level. They're less likely to move to the next level. Instead of us looking at the deficit model, we're trying to look at the strength model. So it's on us as adults. It's on us, not on the children, but on us to find out what is their communication level, and let's communicate with them at that level. Then they're more likely to move to the next level. And as their language develops,
and
they're more likely to be engaged in learning.
Sorry, can I just highlight a point that you made? One, our assumptions were when a child comes into school, they have age-appropriate development of language, and that corresponds to grade level demand on their language skills to process and participate in learning. And you just highlighted the current data that is showing that it used to be the language gap or the vocabulary gap used to be profoundly accentuated in poor communities because of lack of exposure. But we are now seeing a huge shift of that into middle class. and it, no matter what parental wealth, children are behind. So that, can you just for a moment, I think people need to digest that, because two things are happening, and I wonder if you, one is when you don't process information that is a vehicle to complete or execute. That means I need you to, like, I give this example all the time, close the door only if the window is open. In order to take, this is a simple sentence, right? But it has this clause that changes the direction of what you do first. You have to check the window. But if the child does not have working memory or does not have the capacity to process this linguistic code, they're going to be behind. And the classroom assumption, and I'm not saying faulting teachers for that, but they feel I'm ready to teach. Are you must have brought all the skills to learn. So I can you tell us, is this measure that is freely available, language is a missing link, tool available to educators, is this being prolifically used and applied?
It's being used pretty widespread in the UK. In fact, Emily Rubin does training around the world. Her expertise is in autism. She was at the Marcus Center for Autism for several years. She's the primary trainer. She's the star of the show. But we have school systems that are doing the training, and the training includes the engagement ladder.
Oh, wow. Which I've seen your engagement ladder.
A teacher can measure or determine a student's engagement level, and many times it is related to language. And we're not talking about referring a child to an SLP. We're talking about making the classroom more language rich.
Yes.
For all the students. But it's also using the ladder to determine which students are engaged in learning on a scale of 0 to 5, and what you can do for those who are not engaged, because there's a way to find out why they're not engaged. But we tend to, especially with children who are quiet, who don't really engage in class, we think, well, they're learning, they must be learning. Maybe they do okay on exams, but it's not as well as they could be doing. So the engagement ladder does give the teacher something to work from. And it's, again, tied back to the language. And then also embedded in that is the climate of the classroom and the climate of the school, because you have to create conditions for learning. You have to create conditions for engagement. There's a lot of preparation that goes into creating conditions for engagement. It doesn't occur if there's a negative school climate.
So can we pause in, since you're moving to the second topic? So I think what I'll just summarize for our listeners that Garry is talking about, that when we come, there's a lot of conversation about science of reading, but there are precursors, which may be more visible set of skills. And the science is so deep and wide that we may or may not have adequate training offered to the teachers, or even parents may not be aware. But the hierarchy, I see it, is the science of development of language, science of motivation, which is same as science of engagement, and then science of learning, and then comes science of reading. So now you are also talking, there are conditions that are conducive to that, promote that engagement once the language is appropriate, and the exchange between teacher and students is at par with the level of competence that the students are showing. Correct? Did I summarize it?
That's very good.
So now, if you don't mind, tell us, since this may be a new term for some listeners, what do you mean by climate? And also, because the term comes from climate, and people need to distinguish between weather and climate, but how much agency people have over climate. So I would love for you to kind of maybe start there.
Well, let me start with a lesson I learned the hard way many years ago. When I first started talking about school climate, I was accused of talking about a left-wing agenda, that it was something that was too liberal, and people did not understand really what I was talking about. So when I talked to Rotary clubs or talked to teachers even, I was not doing a very good job of communicating with them. So I realized this: and I changed my approach. When I first started doing the presentations, I started talking about workplace climate.
Hmm.
And I said, now, let me explain what workplace climate is. And most people nodded their head when I asked, do you know what workplace climate is? They said, they're nodding their head, affirmative. I said, so workplace, make sure we're on the same page. Workplace is like this. If you go to work, you feel safe, you feel secure, you trust your colleagues, you can communicate with your colleagues. If you're upset with your colleagues, you can work it out. You have a leader who can facilitate any disagreement. The building's not too cold. The room is not too hot. Your furniture is not broken. Your computer actually works. If you're out sick, somebody checks and see how you're doing. When you come back to school, come back to work after you've been sick, somebody asks, well, are you okay? Is there anything I can do for you? That's workplace climate.
Hmm.
That's also school climate. The school is a workplace. If teachers don't feel comfortable at school, if they don't feel like the leadership in the school supports them or understands them or cares about them, then how do we expect teachers then to transfer that to caring about students? If their classroom is hot and students are falling asleep, how does that affect learning? We want kids to be engaged. We want them, therefore, to learn from being engaged. We want teachers to be good at teaching, but how is that possible if the classroom is hot or cold, or the desks are broken, the desks are old, or the equipment is not new, it's not up to date? So the climate of the school is more than just, it's the physical part of the school. It's the attitude of leadership to the teachers and the teachers to students and teachers among themselves. At last count, I've been in probably 800 schools around the nation. And one of the first places I go to is the teacher's lounge. And just sit and listen.
What do you look for?
I just listen. And not to oversimplify, but if I hear something like this, all the students here are the same way. All the students here just are acting the same way. If I hear that, then the climate of school is probably not very, very positive. But I've been in a lot of schools where, even in areas, just impoverished communities where I really didn't feel safe in the community, but the school was wonderful.
Really?
Kids were happy. Teachers were happy. Very, very little staff turnover. All those conditions have to be in place for us to really expect learning to take place. Because you think about it, if you don't feel safe in the school, you're not going to be engaged in learning. If you're afraid to go in the hallway because there's bullies in the hallway, you're not going to be engaged in learning. So we have to be aware of the climate of the school. Then I'm often asked, well, what's the difference between the culture and the climate? Culture is what you have. Climate is why you have it.
Oh, I see.
Culture, we care about each other. We understand each other. We're sensitive to different cultures in the building. We are sensitive to change that may take place in the community. We're sensitive to how kids react to changes at home and changes in the schedule and changes in how the school operates. But the climate is what holds it up. The climate is what it's what creates the culture and what nurtures the culture and what protects the culture. And we cannot take any of that for granted and then expect children to learn. We can't expect children to learn unless they're engaged, and they're not going to be engaged if they don't feel comfortable in school, if they don't feel like somebody cares about them, and if they don't feel challenged.
I think I want to highlight something you're pointing out here. When we think about outcomes, when we think about success for every child, we are so focused. The only way, rather, to gauge child's progress is through grades. And it's a very tedious and terrible, or performance on a test, whatever, whether it's a statewide, national standardized test. And what you're describing is maybe almost considered irrelevant to learning. You know what I mean? Like, nobody gets up and says, let's see if I have a good curriculum to teach. How is the climate? How is the culture?
Mhm.
So what is happening? Well, where do you think this needs to be housed? Because you're describing something that is almost feels like a precursor to learning to occur. But I think can single person do it? Like, it's not a teacher who comes prepared then kind of completely loses his or her mind because there's total chaos in the classroom, or the three kids who are the ruckus creators, and they're now giving the teacher a hard time. That is not isolated. It's housed in that hallway. It's housed in that school. It's housed in that district, is what you're saying,
Well,
right?
the way to approach this would be what Georgia has done. Not saying it's the best way necessarily, but it's in some ways been effective, and that is to, first of all, to highlight the importance of school climate by measuring school climate.
Yeah.
So Georgia has created, and did create several years ago, the school climate rating. So every school in Georgia with grades from grades 3 to 12, there's a school climate rating of the school on a scale of 1 to 5, 5 being a positive climate, 1 being a not so positive climate, in fact, a negative climate. And it's made up of 4 elements. The Georgia Student Health Survey, which is the anonymous survey given to students. For the younger kids, it's a teacher assisted, but it's still anonymous in that they take it online. That's about 25% of the school climate rating. And then attendance is another 25% of the school climate rating, both the teacher and student attendance. And discipline data is
Can I
another.
ask you to elaborate on that? So we may quickly make a judgment that student is not coming because the conditions at home. But you're also saying it could be that because the child doesn't want to come to school because of the conditions in the school itself.
Could be. But
Uh,
regardless of the reason, the
but
attendance,
absenteeism indicative of that
sure.
component.
And we could spend a whole session talking about student attendance, because I facilitated a group that studied student attendance for 6 months. We met every 2 weeks for 6 months, and the result was an 81-page report. If you'd like to see it, I can send it to you.
Please do, and I would definitely include in the show notes as well. Well,
And
can you give us a quick highlight about what came about?
Well, the study committee was created by the Get Georgia Reading Cabinet, and they felt like the focus on improving literacy obviously is well intended and necessary, but there might be some elements that we're overlooking, like engagement we talked about earlier, but also attendance. In looking at the data, 25%, almost 25% of Georgia students were chronically absent. So we can do whatever we want to about improving literacy, but we're going to have to focus some attention on attendance. And 25% chronically absent. What does chronically absent mean? That means they've missed at least 18 days of school per year.
Out of 180 days, right?
Yeah. That's a lot. That's over 3 weeks of school.
That's a lot of missing school.
So, improving literacy rates without focusing somewhat attention on attendance is not going to get you where you need to be. So we looked at data. The report includes a whole section on data. One question that came up that I asked the Atlanta Regional Commission to look at was something that I hadn't heard anybody ask about. I mean, I was curious about it is, well, okay, we have some attendance issues, but what would happen if we improved attendance? Maybe it's not that important. So I asked the research director of the Atlanta Regional Commission this question. I said, if we reduced chronic absenteeism by 5%, what would be the outcome? It raised the reading levels by over almost 7%. So that Georgia is at 38.5% of the students are reading proficiently into the third grade. That would go to over 45%, which would put Georgia within the top 10 nationally by improving attendance.
That is the magic bullet right there.
Well, it just shows that it's important. That was my point, was try to find out, well, is it really that important?
What's the impact of that?
We're assuming that it's important, but let's validate that. Also, research, it was done by the Department of Education a few years ago, found out that learning is significantly impacted after the 5th day of absence and exponentially after that.
Oh, wow.
And yet we have parents, because part of the study was the Technical College of Georgia did a study including over 100 parents about attendance. There were 10 questions about attendance, and parents think that if a student misses 1 or 2 days a month of school, that's not so bad. They don't realize that after the 5th day, learning is impacted. And 1 day a month over the course of 9 months of education, you're losing some significant learning. So most of the rest of the report, we focus on what does impact attendance based on research. It's heavily based on research. It's like, my goodness, there must be, I think there's over 150 footnotes and probably 50 to 70 references. So it's very, very heavily steeped in research. But what I think was most significant about the report, in addition to the data, is that we looked for what's working. So we looked at schools around the nation that improved attendance. We looked at school districts around the nation that improved attendance. We worked with a national organization called Attendance Works to identify strategies that have been working around the nation. So the report, half of the report really is focusing on what works instead of just focusing on the problem. I'm a firm believer of appreciative inquiry. And that concept of appreciative inquiry is let's focus on what works and really understand why it works so that we can perhaps replicate it or at least see where and if it could work in certain situations. So that's a quick summary of that report. I'm proud of the report for the work that the group did because of the focus on really digging into the data, but also, like I said, finding those. There were 19 categories of elements at work, elements that need to be addressed in developing a comprehensive plan. School climate's one of them. There's working on engagement, improving language skills. That's part of it too. Having appropriate award systems. There's a long list of things that can be done that are effective.
And you're highlighting that if the problem was not created in one day, the solution also is going to require many people, many stakeholders to come together. But I love that you're saying that really by focusing on what's working, the discouragement we are feeling around the nation about so many students are struggling, and as if it sounds like the way sometimes it comes across that it's unattainable goal almost. And I love that you're concretely saying, no, this concerted effort, specific strategic effort can really work. And that's how, to me, it's activating our own executive function to solve a problem that's in front of us. The part that I think also struck out for me so you pointed out that if we are thinking about culture and climate, we need to measure it. And so you have specific tools to measure it. And once you measure it, can you talk a little bit about the teacher's relationship to the process of teaching when teaching can pose a challenge? I mean, to me, I often say to students or explain to educators when they are dealing with students that learning by design is not knowing. So anytime you go about knowing anything, it is going to create anxiety. So if we don't have a proper mechanism to educate our children, the distinction between this incessant worry, without any reason, but really appropriate worry and concern for not understanding, we can keep them motivated that you're absolutely right to feel anxious because this is so tedious. This
Right.
is probably not making sense because it requires you to think about that. I think there's a way to distinguish. So I'm just wondering, maybe you can share some of your thoughts about role of educators and parents
Well,
when it comes
what
to.
you just described in a very beautiful way about students, that applies. Just take the word student out and put teacher in there. What
Yes.
you just said is that what appeals to you? What are you struggling with? What do you need? Too often it's been, and this is you've heard this before, but I just want to emphasize it. When I was in schools and I was a principal of an alternative school where we had 600 students that were sent there by a discipline tribunal. All 600 were sent there by a discipline tribunal. Now that was a challenge. And when I first got there, we had tremendous teacher turnover because you can imagine. I mean, you put all your discipline issues in one school.
Oh my goodness.
But it was better than them being expelled. That was the philosophy. But I asked the teachers, we met every day after school, what worked today and what went wrong. And we kept a note of each one of those daily debriefings. We call them debriefings. What worked today, and we made notes of what worked. We kept an ongoing diary, as it were, or dialogue related to the diary of what actually worked and what didn't work. And many times what didn't work was when it was top down. What worked most of the time is when the teachers were creative enough to think of something that made, perhaps, you have to have standards, you have to have assessments, you have to have, all those things, obviously, that make a school system operate and make them functional and make them accountable. But too often, I just don't think we're asking teachers, what do you need? What is working for you? What doesn't work? Why does whatever work? Why does it work? What are you having trouble with? And so the professional development needs to come from the teachers up, and then that needs to be transferred to the university system and teacher preparation programs. Teachers are really interested when I talk to them about climate, the culture and climate of their classroom, the climate of the school. This is what to look for. This is how it's being measured. And the feedback usually is interesting related to that, but also how they are expected to perform and the training that they receive. Many of them, and I'm not criticize the university system of Georgia. Some of them think that the training program could be more relevant. Our students are telling us that school needs to be more relevant, and teachers are telling us their training needs to be more relevant. So maybe there's a common theme there.
And also time to edit. Like one of the conversations I was having about even the concept of executive function, like how students take responsibility for their own learning by activating skill set, being organized, managing their time, focusing, needs to be taught to teachers. And every higher ed institution, I wouldn't say every, but most that I have spoken to, their answer is they don't have time. They do not have any place they can insert this. So my question really is, what can you remove that may not be relevant anymore? But I don't know. Does that kind of edit happens?
Well, but you're hitting on an important point, is what is important and what is the role of the teacher training program, but also what is the role at the local school level? Because local school districts in Georgia and in other states, many of them have the capacity to do additional training or provide additional support for teachers. Coaching is, with a lot of teachers, they really, really like the concept of coaching. They feel like it really helps them, particularly the teachers who are relatively new to teaching. I hear time and time again how much they appreciate having a coach that they can go to and just run ideas by, but also learn, again, a shared experience from the coaches. When I was in class, I did this, and when that situation came up, this is how I handled that. And I'm even asked when I go into some schools, they'll ask me, well, we have a teacher who's having some classroom management problems. What should we do?
Yes.
And I tell them, well, I can't tell you what to do, but I can tell you when I was a school psychologist, many times I was asked to go into schools and work with a teacher who had classroom management problems. And I said, you have to give them something to do that's very tangible, very concrete first. Not just talk about it, but just give them something that gives them the sense that they have control. And so I would tell them, okay, we're going to divide the class up into smaller units. Your class is not now a class of 20 students. It's a group of 4 students made up of 5 students in each group. So it was kind of the old divide and conquer, and teachers felt like they were in more control immediately. And from that point, you could talk about some of their skills, some other strategies they can use when they're interacting with a student who's misbehaving. But trying to give them some small success right up front was so important that they do have some control. And that was just an example of that, because as you mentioned earlier, and I talk about MAP, M-A-P, quite often: motivation, ability, and prompt. If you're not going to change unless you're motivated to change. But even if you're motivated to change, if you don't have the ability to change, you can't change. And even if you're motivated in ability,
there's no prompt to change.
If you're not prompted or encouraged to change, it's not going to happen. So, and that applies to students, and it applies to teachers, and it applies to administrators as well. Sometimes I go into schools, I'll be honest with you, the problem is right in the front office.
So, Garry, I think I could keep you here for hours watching listeners' listening span. I wanted to close out with this really important question. There's been a lot of conversation about learning recovery, but we know it's not work. So, one, if you can just quickly explain to our audience what that is, and what are your thoughts about that?
Well, these are my thoughts about that. We came out of the pandemic, and our children lost a lot of learning time, and we spent, and the focus was, and teachers were really encouraged. In fact, they were pressured and I understand why, to recover that learning that was lost, as if the pandemic never occurred.
Yes, we have to pretend that it came in the way. No, it happened to all of us.
So our children went through the worst health crisis in 100 years, and we act like it didn't occur. We have children who lost friends or relatives or neighbors, parents who lost colleagues, friends, neighbors, relatives. They were traumatized. I mean, you're talking about adverse childhood experiences. The pandemic was an adverse childhood experience. We should have focused on the mental health and the mental well-being of our children as they came out of the pandemic first. But we expected them and our teachers to get everybody engaged in learning when they're recovering from a pandemic. They're recovering from loss. They've been through look how traumatic it was to us. I mean, we are isolated for 2 years for all practical purposes, and we're just going to act like, well, that's the past, don't worry about it. We've got to focus on learning loss. Let's focus on the mental health first.
Yes.
And then engagement would come later. The engagement would kick in once the children feel somewhat repaired from that traumatic experience that they went through, and at least acknowledge that it happened. We have teachers who are still struggling from what the pandemic did to their families. And yet we're asking teachers, well, just forget about that. You've got to focus on learning loss.
And wasn't that like 3 years ago? Wasn't that 2 years ago?
Those kids get caught up. Come on now, get with it.
No, I think you are bringing up something profound, which is I like this analogy I use. Like, you don't tell a diabetic this, produce insulin. Like, that's never like something you say. But here we are, anything in the domain of mental health, you're absolutely saying, oh, but that was pandemic. What did it do to you? And
Yeah.
yeah, get over it. Like, the mental health is almost like on some sort of timer, or
Well,
there's like time limit.
and we failed to notice this too, is that all indications were an increase in mental health issues with our children before the pandemic.
Yes.
That trend was going up as far as increase in mental health concerns. That was going up before the pandemic.
It's the straw that broke the camel's back, which was the pandemic.
So not only have we ignored what happened from the pandemic, we ignored what was going on even before the pandemic.
So, Garry, as we wrap this up, the kind-hearted psychologist that you are and a warm-hearted poet that you are, leave us with some message of hope. You have every juncture have been talking about, you have always noticed things that always work. So if you have a message for all our listeners, and particularly if, to me, that like the mental health crisis is the heap of it all. On top of the heap is that if we made children feel grounded and not so anxious and wired, I think there's likelihood of they becoming learning ready. What's your message for us?
Well, it's a message of hope because I do see things that work. We hear, and we're just so inundated every day with the news of something negative. If you watch the news frequently, you're just going to come away with a negative attitude about everything because it just seems like nothing is working, everything is falling apart, nothing is built to last, and that's just not true. As long as we continue to care about each other and support each other and understand our strengths and weaknesses and build on what works and build on our strengths. And I'm not being naive about it because my life has been a very difficult life in a lot of ways, but I still maintain this, and I will from now on, that I'll maintain this attitude that we have to remain positive because things do work. We can make things better. We just have to have the will to make things better. And while it's okay to be task-oriented, it can't be at the expense of being purpose-driven. We just stay task-oriented. We will always find the tasks that we can't do. We always find the checklist that we can't complete. And it's okay, like I said, to be task-oriented as long as we're still purpose-driven.
Love that. Still purpose driven. And, I think, I don't know in this world what greater purpose than leaving the next generation better prepared. I'm so grateful to you for the work you have done. Most inspirational, transformative, but one of the best qualities in you and the way you deliver your life's work is in extreme clarity. I think that to me is palatable, understandable, but also applicable. Like, it's not like a heady talk, some abstract notions that maybe consider if your heart opens. No, it is very specific. It's very clear. And it's very, very hope-driven, hope-centered. So I deeply thank you. All right, folks, that's all the time we have. I know this was a little bit long, but I thought it's worth your time and attention to listen to this very, very meaningful conversation. And if I know you care about our educational system, educating children of America is something we all collectively need to take seriously. And I thank you for joining us on that journey. Thank you, Garry, again, for being a guest. And thank you, listeners, for being a participant in this important journey. Please, if you enjoyed this session, share this with your colleagues, friends, your neighbors. Leave us a review because that helps people to find us. And once again, please lead with prefrontal lobes. Those are the two best gifts we have. Garry, thank you for being here today.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Full Prefrontal, exposing the mysteries of executive function. To contact your host, Sucheta Kamath, and learn more about her work on improving executive function, visit her website at exqinfiniteknowhow.com. That's www.exqinfiniteknowhow.com. Tune in next week for another informative episode of Full Prefrontal, hosted by the founder of EXQ, Sucheta Kamath.